Hello, and welcome again to this Trauma-Informed Community Coach Training course. I'm Susan Klumpner, and I'm here again with Dr. Mays Imad, neuroscientist and national expert on trauma-informed education. In modules 1 and 2, we were introduced to the complexity of how trauma develops and is experienced, both acutely and long-term. We also investigated the body's physiological responses to trauma and identified some common response patterns for youth who experience trauma and stress triggers. Today, we will look a little deeper into how youth behavior is affected by the experience of trauma, and we will begin to discuss how coaches and community mentors can help to mitigate the long-term negative health indicators associated with untreated trauma. So to begin with, Dr. Mays.
Hello.
So I know for this conversation, you referenced, I think in Module 1, the idea or the terms risk and protective factors. And just so we're on the same page as we begin this conversation, I was wondering if you could just define what these two things are.
So those two things are either going to increase the likelihood of a negative trajectory or a positive trajectory. So a protective factor is a situation, is an adult that is going to help the child take a positive trajectory. So even though they experience adversity, even though the child experienced traumatic events in the past, it will not necessarily predict that the child is going to have a difficult or a negative adulthood. So that is a protective factor.
It protects the child. Yeah.
Yes. A risk is a factor that's going to increase the likelihood that the child is going to be set up for even more traumatic future. And so an example for that, for example, is we talked a little bit about the different factors: race, socioeconomic status, not having a supportive environment. Those are all risks that will increase the likelihood of a negative trajectory.
So I really see like sports-based youth development organizations as, being really into community building, getting as many sort of stakeholders involved, whether that be parents, teachers, family, involved, right? And so how can all these different sort of community members and support systems influence how youth might respond to trauma?
That's an important question. So I would start with having the understanding that the youth we're working with, they come with experiences, past and present experiences that impact the way they show up, they interact with us, they interact with their, and so that experience allows us again to ask accurate questions, to ask what happened to you, what is right with you, how can I help you? And then validating the youth and helping them acquire the tools and the opportunities to direct the attention of their brain to something that is positive, something that is they can grow through.
Are there any sort of other factors that might influence the way that youth might respond to trauma?
Yes, so we know that, for example, if they have peer support, so an adult anchor that we talked about, but also peer support. Other factors, for example, is the child able to voice, express what happened to them? Are they able to, for example, metabolize or work through, the traumatic experience, or are they suppressed and isolated?
And so I wanted to talk and stay with this idea of negative life trajectories a bit. So how do traumatic events how can they lead to mental health struggles?
That's a really important question. I'm really glad you asked. So I don't know if you saw the recent Surgeon General's report. that underscores the mental health crisis among young adults and youth and children. So we know that those who experience a lot of adversities as children, we know that there are all sort of trajectories with respect to their health, with respect to their education, with respect to their socioeconomic status. We now also know that another trajectory is how they're going to be in terms of their mental health. Now, what's interesting is for a long time, we used to think that mental health is just, it's all about the genes, it's all about nature. But it turns out that it's a lot more complicated. We're dynamic beings. We interact with the community and the surroundings. And of course, it's going to impact the way our genes behave, the way our cells behave. So poor mental health is not just not having access to health care. It's not just not having employment. There's also a strong element of the adverse childhood experience. It's a predictive element of mental health, which is why, if we go back to I think the second question you asked me in this series, why should we care about trauma? Well, we care about trauma because it is literally what we do here and now, not only impacts individuals and community, but also the future of our humanity. And so we have the power, we have the opportunity to take a negative situation, right? Understand it, understand the context, but also support a pivot towards something that's more positive.
So it is possible for there to be a more positive trajectory.
Absolutely. And I want to be careful here, right? So there's so much talk about resilience and grit. And that's important because we know that, as we mentioned earlier, that those synaptic connections are not fully formed until late 20s. So we have an opportunity to create a positive environment that then enables positive synaptic connections, right? But we want to be careful not to just say it's all about resilience. In fact, there's an article that I love to mention. It was published in May 2020 by Dr. Muna Hana Atisha. She's the physician that exposed the lead in water in Flint, Michigan. And she wrote an article saying, I am sick of asking children to be resilient. What she was underscoring is this notion of resilience is not just a switch you could turn on or off. It's not just having the will or not. There are many factors that enable us to be resilient. One important factor is the social support. One important factor is the community. So that community and belonging powers resilience. So absolutely, there are opportunities for positive trajectories, and it takes a village, it takes a community.
So you're saying, community support, a support system, all of these things can also support, right, a child's mental health during or after a traumatic event?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And that kind of takes us back to this idea of an anchor, right?
Yes,
like
an anchor that helps a child learn to cope and regulate. So for example, what could happen if a child has experienced a lot of adversities or a traumatic event? They feel overwhelmed. So a simple task of do your homework feels extremely just overwhelming. And because a lot of times children are not really taught to express themselves or even to understand what's happening, the emotion that tends to be dominant is anger. So they feel angry. So in this case, what a coach or a teacher or an adult, a mentor could do is help them identify the emotion and then listen validate, reassure, de-escalate. Those are really important. So we have cells in our body that they act like a mirror. And so if you're telling me you're so angry, and I say, well, of course, we know that it can instantly help you feel seen, right? So, and then there are other things we could model with the children. So, and you're in the middle of a crisis, I'm going to start counting down from 10 backward. What that does, it could help shift attention in the brain to how am I going to count down backward. But there are other things we could do. Activate other senses with them. We could, one thing that I used to teach my niece and my sister is make a fist, really angry, and then relax. And do it again and again. So this rhythmic behavior is an example of regulation. And it becomes a co-regulation when you're doing it with the adult. We're not born with the skills of resilience and mental immunity. We learn those. And so we have the opportunity to leverage the positionality, the power that we have to help them learn to cope and regulate.
So eventually you're saying that youth can learn ways to cope with stress, right? And be able to sort of emotionally regulate. But in your explanation, you also mentioned this idea of co-regulation.
Yes.
What, I'm assuming that has to do with somebody else too, but can you explain a little bit what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. So the adult, it has to do with the adult. So let's say you and I are having a conversation and I'm telling you that I'm having anxiety about an exam that's coming up. And let's say you are just so depleted and you have so much anxiety and you are not even listening to me. What could happen? There is a phenomena called emotional resonance. We pick up on each other's emotions. And so I'm going to pick up on your, especially for children who don't really necessarily have learned how to create boundaries and say, well, that's Susan's problem. I'm not going to, carry that. So what happens if you're not regulated, if you're not able to calm yourself down, the child can then pick up on that, and then that's going to amplify their anxiety even more. And one of the consequences is the child will know they can't feel safe with you because you're always anxious, for example. So that co-regulation is really important to, again, help the child learn to cope, to regulate, but it also gives back. It strengthens that relational opportunity.
That's really interesting to me because sometimes when I talk about working with children, right, I'll say, it doesn't matter what you say, it matters how you say it.
Yes.
Right?
So really important to watch your language, your body language. It's important because we can pick up on that, right? And the nuances are important. So if somebody is telling you and you start rolling your eyes, or you grab your phone and look at it, or you look at it, they feel, they see. And immediately, because when we are in a state of fight or flight, the tendency is to be hypervigilant. The tendency is to be paranoid. Those are protective things. So if I see that, I'm speaking with my mentor or my coach, and she just grabs her phone, and the tendency is to say, she doesn't care about me. So how we show up is so important. What we say is so important.
Yeah, I was just going to say, also what we say is important.
Yes.
So the last question that I have for you is if you could just sort of talk about how relationships with adults and other youth, so other youth in the program too, can facilitate the healing process.
Yeah, that's a really important question. So what relationship with the youth can do, it can, and this is research from trauma research, mental health research, this peer support, one of the things it could do, it could help the individual, the child, recognize that they're not the only one struggling. And so it can help us get out of that I'm the only victim situation. There is that mirroring, and so when you talk and you say, this is what we learned from each other, you know, Desmond Tutu says, I learned to be a human from other human beings. And this is not just for Desmond Tutu, for children, for adults, all of us that way. So there is the relationship part. The relationship helps us feel connected. We're not alone. We belong. Those are all really critical. And then there is the, oh, this person is struggling. Oh, this is how they're dealing with it. Now, with respect to the adult, there is the anchor that we talked about. Children are growing up in an increasingly uncertain environment. The brain, one of the most stressful situations for the brain is an uncertain situation, because the brain acts like a predictive machine. It wants information to make prediction about survival. When there are uncertainties, it stays in that, situation of anxiety. Now, having an adult, this adult comes with a history. And so this adult can help me learn that things are going to be okay. A lot of children don't have the history to say, well, the last time I had this problem, this is what I did, and it turned out all right. They don't have that. So the adult can provide that. That's why in a lot of communities, like indigenous communities, working with the elders is so important, is so integral to the healing process.
Yeah. So adults and other peers can also bring that sort of calmness, the predictability, the consistency.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's needed.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Mays.
Thank you.
Thank you again. And we hope you found value in our discussion of how you, as youth development providers, can better support a child's mental health needs. In Module 4, we will discuss the general principles of trauma-informed care and how we can begin to deploy these strategies in our daily interactions with our students. We hope that, as you engage with these materials, you begin reflecting on whether you've encountered these dynamics in your own coaching experience and whether you'd change anything or approach situations differently if given the opportunity. Remember, this is a reflective journey. Taking stock of past experiences, both strong and lacking, is the only way to improve our practice.